Ever wonder how people get rid of their phobias? Or what in the world exposure therapy is? Stick around and we're going to dive in. Hi, I'm Chelsy Castro, lawyer turned psychotherapist and performance coach. Welcome back to my channel, where we use science to explore ways to help you live, work, and feel better. I'm often approached with questions about different psychological schools of thought, modalities, skills, things like that. And recently, a lot of people have been asking me about exposure therapy. So let's dive right in. Exposure therapy essentially takes something that you as an individual experiences anxiety and fear about, and very slowly and strategically helps you reduce that fear by exposing yourself to the stimulus that is something you fear. So I realize it does sound counterintuitive here, but bear with me. Essentially, what we're doing is let's say you have a fear of dogs, and you don't even want to see a dog. Like, that's how scared you are. If you went in for some exposure therapy, well, first there's going to be a lot of conversations, assessments, assuming all of the proper protocol are followed, and you eventually form what we call a fear hierarchy, which is an identification of your strongest fear, and then bring down to what's a little less awful, what a little less fearful, a little less fearful, a little less fearful, starting at maybe going all the way down to something that is not feared by you at all. So let's assume we have a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being what phobia, and 10 being I can't breathe, I'm having a panic attack, I'm going to die. So you and your therapist would put together this hierarchy list as you get to know each other better, as you do proper assessments, so on and so forth. And you and the therapist would then agree to start out testing how you feel on this hierarchy, on this fear hierarchy, as you move up and up the ladder. So usually anything below what you would rank as a 4, in that 0 to 10, like I'm okay, what phobia, to 10, I'm freaking out, I'm having a panic attack. Anything under that 4 would be considered generally neutral. So one thing I want to point out to you before we move on is, if you haven't noticed, everything is measured and guided by how the patient or client perceives it. This is not an external, uncustomized, therapist-driven metric. We work according to your metric in your fear and the circumstances that create that fear for you. So we start at anything below 4, and essentially it's just exposing you to those things over and over again. And we work with you in the moment to explore the feelings, to explore the thoughts, to explore the physical manifestations and behaviors that are associated with the experience of that fear and the experience, naturally, of that stimuli. And as you get more and more comfortable with those things at the 4 level and below, we then start doing maybe a 4.5, maybe a 5. And it's meant to make you uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to where you are genuinely fearful. We never want to start at something like a 7 or an 8, because we're just that would be setting you into a state of anxiety and then create more fear and more aversion to the stimulus for you. Instead, we want to train your brain to identify that this stimulus is not necessarily going to have the negative impact that you fear it will have. So in the case of someone who fears dogs, we would be there in session, perhaps a few sessions in, having already identified the fear hierarchy. And perhaps we start with a picture of a cartoon dog, and then we move on to a picture of a real dog. Then we move on to animation of a cartoon dog, and maybe a video of a real dog. Then perhaps we go into a more in vivo setting where there is actually a real dog in the same vicinity as you, perhaps a block away, and you can observe the dog a block away while you know that you are absolutely safe. And eventually, as we move farther and farther up the fear hierarchy, you get closer and closer to the exposure of the significant stimulus that creates that phobia for you. In the case of our example, it may be an individual standing next to a dog and eventually petting that dog. So this individual going through this process, which for some people can be lengthy, but that's okay. It's better to move slowly and steadily than really quickly up that fear hierarchy and then risk having some sort of significant aversion to the stimulus because you didn't give yourself an opportunity to learn, to teach that brain of yours, yep, those brains of our ancestors are still in there, that threat is not legit. So a lot of people are hesitant to try exposure therapy because they're really scared that it's going to hurt them in some way. They rather live in fear and avoidance of whatever this phobia is than actually confront it. And let me tell you, the phobias don't have to be external, like a dog or a spider or heights or water. They can be internal feelings that you're also trying to avoid. But more on that another day. That's a little bit more complex. So why are people avoiding it? Well, they tend to have certain myths built up around what exposure therapy might do to them. So let's try to dispel some of those myths right now. Myth number 1, exposure therapy is unethical and harmful. No, this is based on the incorrect assumption that a therapist pushes clients and patients to the edge into very uncomfortable, distressful situations where the client does not have a say. Quite to the contrary, the client directs the level of exposure and the duration and the intensity. The therapist is there as a guide and as a support and to provide structure to make sure that any exposure that does happen is done in a helpful and not a harmful way. Myth number 2, exposure therapy only makes people more anxious. And this one's a little tricky because, as you heard from the explanation earlier, exposure therapy is there to trigger your anxiety response, to trigger that stress in the short term, so that in the long term, you can train your brain to not perceive that stimulus as a threat and therefore not have the fear response. So essentially, in a nutshell, what happens is that each time you expose yourself to the stimulus, next time you will feel that fear just a little less. So the more exposure you get, the less fear you have. Myth number 3, people with severe anxiety are not good candidates for exposure therapy. Wrong again. Actually, there's a significant body of research that tells us that people with severe anxiety can actually benefit a great deal and sometimes even more from exposure therapy than those with mild to moderate anxiety. And of course, it's important to note that exposure therapy shouldn't always be used as a first line of treatment. It's often accompanied with other issues such as depression or substance abuse or trauma, which might need to be addressed either before or in conjunction with exposure therapy. Well, that's all for today. Keep those questions coming, and I'll see you next time. Bye.